Welcome. Today we're going to explore the question, what is philosophy? Philosophy can be broken down into about 5 main branches, and these include logic, epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and aesthetics. There are other areas in the study of philosophy beyond these 5 or within these 5, things like the philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, as well as political philosophy. So let's look at this first main branch. Let's take a look at this first main branch, logic. Now, logic deals with reasoning conducted or assessed according to strict principles. It comes from the root Greek word logos, which deals with the principles of order, knowledge. To understand it, you might consider the rules of mathematics or the rules of physics. It's these types of rules, but applied to language. You might be familiar with some programming languages that deal with computers, like Swift or C++. These are all logic-based languages. So it doesn't matter if you're using English, math, or computer code. There are rules and principles that guide this usage. So if you were to translate some informally logical terms into logical terms, it would look something like this. And here we have an example of mathematical logic. And then here we have computer logic, computer programming language. And then finally an example of informal logic where we have come to understand the logical rules of language. All right, the next branch of philosophy that we're going to look at is epistemology. And epistemology asks the question, what can we know and how can we know it? And moves on to ask, how is this knowledge gained? Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest philosophers, in his seminal work, The Critique of Pure Reason, raises some very interesting questions. He asks, what can I know? What ought I to do? And what may I hope for? Within epistemology, there are some subfields. For example, philosophy of language. Philosophy of language raises some really interesting questions, such as, is there a correlation between a word and its meaning? Or is it arbitrary? Science fiction and fantasy novels give us a great demonstration of this question. The writers can create entire systems of time, money, geography. They create names and lineages, flora and fauna. And what you will see is that some of them are successful and some are not successful. And I think that that success hinges on this correlation between a word and its meaning. Onomatopoeias, for example, words that sound like what they are, buzz, ring, woof, sizzle, affirm that this connection is not arbitrary. While at the same time, different languages have similar onomatopoeias, but they're different from language to language, which conflicts with the idea that the correlation is not arbitrary. Interesting questions. And then another area of epistemology is the philosophy of mind. And the philosophy of mind introduces what's known as the mind-body problem. And I'll demonstrate this with a story. So, once upon a time, there was a girl named Nikki, and Nikki loved to ride her motorcycle. And there was a young man named Sam, and unfortunately, Sam had brain cancer. His body was healthy, but his brain was infected with cancer cells. Well, Nikki gets in a motorcycle accident, but she's wearing her helmet. So although the rest of her body is extremely damaged, her brain is not. So in this imaginary story, Nikki's brain is transplanted into Sam's body. So the question raised in this story is, who survives that surgery? Now, whether you say that Nikki survives or Sam survives, what is interesting is what your answer reveals about how you define what constitutes a human being. If you think the body constitutes the human being, then you're going to say that Sam survives that operation. If you say the mind constitutes a human being, then you're going to say that Nikki survives that operation. And perhaps if you think that a soul is what constitutes a human being, then you might question the goodness of such a surgery. And so this is just a brief touch on the mind-body problem. The next branch of philosophy we're going to cover is metaphysics. And metaphysics asks the question, what is most fundamentally real? Well, before we touch on what metaphysics is, I want to be very clear about what metaphysics is not. Interestingly enough, if you go into a bookstore and into the metaphysics section, what you will find there is interesting. You might find works on aliens or the Loch Ness Monster or witches or tarot, the afterlife, ghosts, astrology. And what all of these things have in common are that they're not considered to be real. So although you might find these things in the metaphysical section of a bookstore, I want to be clear that these things are not considered real, and this is not metaphysics. I suspect that this stems from the fact that metaphysics is so difficult as an area of study that people have mistaken the term or applied it to things that were, in some sense, difficult to understand. Again, this is not what we are talking about when we discuss metaphysics for the purposes of this class. So let's look at some attempts at metaphysics. Interestingly enough, through time, it has been attempted to describe what is most fundamentally real in the world as we know it, and there's been a suggestion that it's air or water, fire, earth, a piron, atoms, or even the Higgs boson particle. If you imagine, if you are trying to figure out what is most fundamentally real, you might consider something like water, because when asked what is the human body made of mostly, what constitutes the face of the earth mostly, you might say water. So this could lead you to consider that what is most fundamentally real is in fact water. And a branch within the study of metaphysics is what's known as ontology. And it asks the question, what is there? What exists? Not at a fundamental level, but at a, are these things real? So you might look at categories or how the universal relates to the particular. So you have a particular dog, but how does that relate to the category of dogs? And when we look at categories, we might ask, are there such things as animals, vegetables, and humans? There are particulars that fit into these categories, but do these categories themselves exist? How about feelings? You experience them, but how do you go about measuring them or reproducing them or demonstrating that they're real? Romantic poetry, for example, might be one example of someone trying to demonstrate that their love is real. Also, the question arises, are are numbers real? So if I asked you to give me 4, F-O-U-R, well, you could give me 4 eggs, for example, but you can't give me the number 4. So is the number 4 real? This is a question that ontology asks. And also within metaphysics is the study of cosmology. And cosmology has to do with the origin of the universe or the origin of the world. And you're familiar with some cosmological theories, the Big Bang theory, for example. There are other cosmological theories, the Hindu creation account, where Vishnu is asleep on the river of forgetfulness and has a dream in which a lotus blossoms out of his belly button, and within that lotus, as it opens, we see the god Brahma. Brahma breathes out and the world comes into existence, and he breathes in and the world goes back out of existence. And then the creation account found in Genesis. In the beginning there was darkness and void. That story where God separates the heavens and the earth, creates light, etc. Our next category is ethics. Moral philosophy attempts to answer the question, what ought I to do? It's the study of right and wrong conduct. And ethics generally can be broken into 3 categories: metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. Metaethics asks what constitutes an adequate ethical guide. Normative ethics says this is what you should do, and applied ethics examines controversial issues: abortion, infanticide, animal rights, capital punishment, warfare. We're going to look here at some examples of some ethical theories. We have divine will, which is, of course, demonstrated here by St. Augustine. In answer to the question, what ought I to do? I ought to do God's will. And then we have John Stuart Mill, who in answer to the question, what ought I to do, said that which creates the greatest good for the greatest number. You may be a little familiar with this. It's also known as utilitarianism. And then Immanuel Kant, in answering the question, what ought I to do, formulated the categorical imperative. And now on to political and social philosophy. Political and social philosophy attempts to answer questions like what is justice, what is freedom, what is law, what is the best form of governance? Is it communism? Is it rule by the church? Is it anarchy, democracy, dictatorships? And finally, our last branch of philosophy is aesthetics. And this is the study of beauty and asks the question, what is art? What is taste? What is beautiful? And is what is beautiful simply a matter of taste? Well, let's briefly stop and take a look at this painting Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez. If I were to ask you the question, what is the subject of this painting? Because of perhaps paintings we've seen in the past, our eyes might be drawn to the princess, the little girl at the center of the painting. And although the painting's interesting, I'm not sure if I were to come across it in an art gallery, it would particularly catch my attention. I'm a dog lover, so I might notice the dog. I might notice the uniqueness of the dwarf included in the painting. But I'm not sure my attention would be taken any deeper than that. However, upon closer examination, you will see to the left of the painting what appears to be the painter himself, and he is facing the canvas, and we are facing the back of the canvas. So if you shift your perspective, technically, the viewer is the subject of the painting that Diego is painting, the painting of which we can see just the back of. So that's interesting and shifts the answer to the question, what is the subject? Because it seems that I, the viewer, am the subject. More interestingly, if you look toward the back of the room, you will see a mirror on the wall. And in that mirror on the wall is the king and queen. So the mirror is showing that the king and queen are standing in the position that you, the viewer, take while looking at the painting. So are you the king or queen? Are you the subject of this painting? Is it the princess, your daughter, looking at you? All very interesting questions. And addresses, I think, beautifully this question of what is art, and that it is not a matter of taste, and that it is a matter of some sort of transformative experience presented by the opportunity to experience art. So just moving on, again, aesthetics asks the question, what is beauty? What is art? And is it simply a matter of taste? In An Introduction to the Art of Wondering by James Lee, he presents this idea of a synoptic wheel. It's not that important that you can read it, but what you can see is the many different disciplines one might study are there, also with some of the everyday aspects of life. And he's raising a really interesting point that philosophy tries to cover and explore. And this is the idea that whatever you put at the center of this synoptic wheel, each of the disciplines is going to have a very specific perspective on that issue, as if they were looking into, say, a walled garden from one window. And so if you were to look at a child, for example, in the center of this synoptic wheel, well, each of these disciplines is going to have a very different perspective on that content. So chemistry might tell you about the chemical makeup of a human child. Sex education might tell you how to avoid having children. Psychology might tell you how to treat that child and the different developmental stages that child will go through. Religion might tell you that that child's life is intrinsically valuable. And looking at it from the perspective of evolution, it might say that through the line of primates, human infants have developed. So it's an interesting idea that philosophy tries to stand back and understand just this whole wheel of perspectives when looking at any single topic. So we started this lecture asking and exploring the question, what is philosophy? And I myself have an answer for this question that I promote, and that is that philosophy is the history of great questions and the answers formulated by great minds. And I would say some of those questions include, what am I? Who am I? Where am I? Why am I here? What do I do between now and when I die? And what happens at death and beyond? Again, all fascinating questions, and philosophy is the exploration of these questions and the answers that have been formulated throughout history by great minds. All right. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day.